everyone. South by Southwest. We are so happy to be here. My name is Chloe Sorvino. I'm the staff writer at Forbes who heads up all food and agriculture coverage. I have a book that came out December called Raw Deal, Hidden Corruption, Corporate Greed, and the Fight for the Future of Meat. We're going to do a signing after this panel out there if anyone's interested in talking more. But we have an all-star panel here, and now is really the time to be really digging into these conversations about how do we scale and create a healthier, sustainable, more equitable food system. And that starts with protein. It's the most of what people eat. It's the most expensive, and it gets the most funding. It's the biggest part of our industry. And so there's a lot there, and we are at the point where we don't have enough time or money to waste on the wrong solutions, but we also don't have enough time to start from scratch, and we have to throw everything we've got at this. And so I'd love to just kick it off with these amazing women and hear more about what brought you to this work and what are you trying to do to make that next step for our food system that we need.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle. I am the CEO and one of the co-founders of a company called Hyphae. We take wasted nutrients from food manufacturing water, so think about a can of chickpeas, that water that's inside, and we turn it into a really low-cost feedstock for fermentation to power, the potential for biomanufacturing to create all sorts of low carbon impact alternative proteins and plastics and materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I came into this work because I used to run a wastewater treatment facility at ExxonMobil. I'm a chemical engineer by background, spent the first decade of my career in oil and gas, and was able to kind of see the inefficiencies that come through some of just the infrastructure and how we make food and how we make other essential goods. And now I'm here trying to take those inefficiencies and using them to make the food system better.
Hello, I am Shelby Smith. Kenzie already kind of gave me a shout out earlier. I am the founder, owner, Cricket Lady. I raise crickets for human consumption and have a company called Jiminy Crickets based out of Ames, Iowa. Believe it or not, did not grow up wanting to be a cricket farmer, which I'm sure is a shocker.
Really?
I know, man. Was not a lifelong dream. So luckily, I was pretty good at basketball because I really didn't want anything to do with Iowa or staying in the state, agriculture, any of the things. I went on full scholarship to St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia to play basketball. I'm only 5'7", I was a point guard. Graduated from there with a finance degree, went overseas, played in Ireland, got my master's in finance from Trinity College in Dublin, continued my playing career, and then started a career as an equity derivatives trader for a Canadian bank while I was there in Ireland. 3.5 years in, figured out finance probably wasn't for me, and quit and moved back to that family farm I said I would never go back to, and started growing corn and soybeans with my dad, but decided that wasn't really what I wanted to do either, so I went and looked for a niche market and landed on crickets. So this was 2018, bought 10,000 crickets 10 days after I got the idea, and here we are 5 years later.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Wolf. I'm the co-founder and CEO of New Way Foods. I was never tall enough to play basketball, so I said, why don't I make plant-based shrimp? So we have been creating and manufacturing plant-based shrimp for going on 2 years now, and it is making its way into restaurants across the country. I myself am also an engineer by background. You've got two Michelles up here, both with engineering degrees from Carnegie Mellon. Same year, so something must have been in the water at that time that got us there. But it was my passion for having impact with my technical background and wanting to do something for our foods and looking at the ocean and saying, hey, wait, no one is paying attention to this thing that provides most of the oxygen for our world. And shrimp being the biggest category and one of the ones that's the poster child for issues that can happen in our seafood supply chains, I said, hey, if we can make a tasty alternative, we can reduce some of those pressures and hopefully have more healthy supply chains across our oceans. So very excited to be with these lovely ladies today.
Okay, so much to dig into, and I'm really excited about this panel because the framing is really around the beyond the hype cycle. I'm sure if you guys are here, you're passionate about this food system, and you've probably seen, the ebbs and the flows of the Beyond Meats and the impossibles, not just layoffs, but, crazy valuation upswings, making other startups have to kind of compete and raise at those probably crazy and overzealous multiples. And we're here to talk around how the financial system can underpin success and a more sustainable, equitable food system, but also what that really means. And so my book goes into this a lot, but essentially I think it's important just to have a little framework here because most people, and most founders, when they take investment, they don't understand that it puts them on a certain trajectory, usually 3 to 5 year cycle, and they have to make a return for that. And that means that, investors, pensions, other folks are always looking to profit off of our food system in some ways. And while obviously you need capital, you need to be able to scale. I think there's a lot of different alternatives in finance, especially when it comes to what we're going to talk about. So I'd love to hear it. Now we're in like almost like a recessionary period. I'm hearing a lot about companies that were raising it really high, now having to get stuck into, they're running out of cash, getting stuck into trying to raise more, and now these investors are far more risk averse, already have maybe some bad deals in their funds, and now who do you go to get to that next step? So can you just first off explain to me a little bit about what your financial model is like, how this pressure has been experienced from you, and I know, Shelby, you'll have something fun to say otherwise.
Sure, I can begin. Okay, so my business is a capital-intensive business, which is like not the favorite for venture capitalists, but what is absolutely necessary if we're gonna have wide-scale transformation of how we make food. Specifically in the area that we're in fermentation, you need tanks to make food in a scalable way. You need water, like you're talking about infrastructure, you're talking about CapEx. And so for us, especially in this market, like one comment on that is like unit economics need to be clear. The risks that come with your company, the tech risks, the market risks need to be limited, and they need to be very understood. And so for us, our company is, that's like our focus. Like our whole focus is to become the unlock for biomanufacturing from a cost perspective. So we bake a lot of like different financial revenue streams into that.
But the model would recently change, right? Because you were trying to kind of do everything, not just be the ingredient, but also have the food product that was selling. Can you explain how that changed?
Absolutely. Okay, so we used to, like when we started the company, we were taking these wasted nutrients and using them as a low-cost feedstock for our fermentation, and then we were making mycelium protein powder out of that. And mycelium is the root network of mushrooms that's like super, super healthy and has a lot of different functionalities that are useful. But as we've continued to look into our techno-economic models, we realized that like, hey, in the base case, if we didn't have our enabling technology that makes feed costs really low, it's not like our mycelium protein powder using normal sugar feedstocks, which power fermentation would not be profitable, like would not be able to reach price parity. And it's not just mycelium, which has really great yield. It's literally anybody who's creating a solution with a lower carbon food replacement that is using fermentation, especially CapEx intensive submerged fermentation, is not gonna be able to reach price parity. And so we ended up dropping the complexity of creating a novel ingredient and fully focusing into the enabling technology.
So you're a VC-backed B2B ingredient. Michelle, you want to take it?
Yeah, just to build off of it, I mean, we are also a VC-funded company. And I think what's interesting right now is the market overall is down. And I think with the folks in food, we think that we are in a unique situation and it's just us seeing issues, but this is, the ebbs and flows of the economy. I think for us, it's been really interesting because internally, I can say with confidence, the company has never been better. We have a path to profitability. Sales are up and continuing to go up month over month, but investors who have put in money to the grow at all costs model have pulled back because they're still waiting for some of the larger plays to hit some of those milestones. So that's been something that we've been focused on is like, hey, we have a great business, we're gonna keep growing. You can get on the ride or you cannot. And there's been a lot of talking points within the media too, like, well, plant-based has been a failure, no one is eating this stuff anymore. And that's not true at all. I think as we look at the trends and folks who want to eat better for themselves, for the environment, those trends aren't going away. And so we know that there's still, a market out there. It's just when we look at things like inflation and people not being able to afford the high markup of some of these alt proteins, it's like, yeah, we have to go back to the fundamentals of having a strong business. And that's what we've been really focused on, in addition to investors who have supported us in this journey as well.
And I am the odd man out, as I ever am. I have bootstrapped this entire thing from the beginning. I always say a lucrative first career is a good way to start a business. And also getting into crickets in terms of cost of startup versus getting into other livestock. My first 10,000 crickets with overnight shipping cost me $140. So I don't know of any other livestock that you can get in 10,000 head for $140. Now, granted, it takes quite a few more to make, the equivalent market weight, if you will. But yeah, I have bootstrapped this entire thing. Part of the reason that I have never raised funding is, the conversation you started with of that timeline. I have no interest in being put on somebody else's timeline, and especially in what I see as a slow burn industry. I tell people kind of think about edible insects as sushi in the 80s. It would be, trendy. You'd maybe be able to find it in New York at the time, but you certainly wouldn't be in Ames, Iowa at a sushi restaurant, and that's our favorite date night now is sushi in Ames. I can't say the quality is super great, but the fact is that it's there. And so edible insects are a long timeline, and VCs, it's not sexy enough.
So what has it enabled you to do? And also, can you explain how you've gotten loans? We were talking a little earlier too around, obviously, those loans also come with the privilege, right? The USDA, farm bureaus have pushed out Black, Indigenous, BIPOC farmers systemically.
Yeah, so for me, finance background helps. I always tell people that if you're going to get a degree that you're not going to use, finance is sure a useful one. So I had spreadsheets on spreadsheets projecting things as I started, but I, again, did things in a very non-sexy way and in a way that I knew was not going to necessarily be quote-unquote venture scalable from the beginning, and I thought vertical integration was really important. In the meat industry, as you well know, there's a hefty profit to be made at the processing level. Yeah. And so controlling that whole vertical is important to me from managing a whole slew of risks. But so that's how I started. And like I said, I had the cash there. I had the family support, which I know that not everybody has that privilege. I totally understand that. But then moving forward, going back to the unit economics, because I've bootstrapped it, the unit economics had to make sense. And so because it's made sense, that's why I'm in year 5, in the black for multiple years, and now I'm currently sold out through May with my, great problem to have, but also very frustrating problem to have. I hate leaving demand on the table as a business owner. But, so I will be expanding into a larger barn. Now, I did apply for a grant from the Iowa Department of Agriculture. Unfortunately, was not funded with that project, but because my business is in the healthy place that it is, I can walk into a bank and get a credit line for the amount that I need to finish out this barn because of the built-up demand and everything else that goes with it. So, again, I know it's not the sexy conversation, but if it works, it works.
The business fundamentals surely are there. Okay, and so let's talk about, these are novel foods that comes with maybe some pushback from some customers. Where do you see the adoption going? We were talking a little bit about adoption earlier. The macro numbers do have the Beyonds and the Impossibles of the world going down, but what do you think is the next step to get adoption to where you want it to be, and how do we get there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say number one is price. A lot of folks have asked me, well, hey, it's inflation, everybody's raising your prices. Why don't you raise yours? And I said, I'm not going to raise prices. We have to actually work on bringing our prices down if we're going to get mainstream adoption of our products. So that would be number one. I think you also have to think about the consumers you're selling to. We sell into food service because most seafood is eaten in food service because consumers don't like to cook it. They don't know how to handle it. They're worried about how their house smells, so they're going out to restaurants to eat it. So our customer is really that food service operator and chef. And so we've really had to think about, the last 2 years, what problems are they undergoing? How can our product be a value add? Not just, oh, here's a plant-based option, but how can this help with the labor challenges? And so for us, one of the first things we did was to create a breaded version of the product that could go from freezer to fryer to plate. They didn't have to season it. It was ready to go. And for food service operators facing labor shortages or less skilled labor, this has been a huge win for them as well. So it's really not just about, okay, I'm putting this new novel product onto the market. Of course people are going to love it. Of course it tastes good. I've listened into panels like this with chefs and people who are owning restaurants, running college and university things, and they say, I get the plant-based thing, but some of these products are too hard to mess with, and I don't want to touch them if this is going to be an extra step or I need a special piece of equipment. So I think in terms of adoption, it's really thinking about, okay, how are we solving needs for the consumer beyond just, okay, here's something plant-based, and yeah, it's good for the climate, take this. And that's kind of one of the reasons I love our product, because we've had opportunities to sell into places that don't carry shrimp because we have less of a salmonella risk. You don't have to peel and devein our product. So it's shellfish allergen free, it's kosher, which is almost an oxymoron to say. So we have a lot of opportunity to get into places where even ocean shrimp doesn't have access to.
Take it?
I love to hear Michelle talk about her business because she was like an OG in the plant-based shrimp space, honestly. Like really straight out of college in 2014, she started building this business, and it's awesome to see her like in the market. But anyway, so like to your point, really agree, like it's about the value proposition and not just leaning on like a good idea, because like when inflation's up and you're trying to make decisions based on, you know, your personal finances, like a good idea only goes so far, but it's like the reality of like how much do you have to spend, what does it do for your health, etc. And I think the same applies to any stakeholder that's a partner in your business. So for us, our partners, there's two different ones. It's the people who generate wasted nutrients, and that's a large corporation that does food processing and you know, like is, you know, has inefficiencies. And for them, like, they need to be able to save money. They need to be able to solve water scarcity issues. They need to be able to solve wastewater capacity issues. If we don't solve that, they're not gonna partner with us just on a good idea. And on the fermenter side, the one thing that's keeping fermentation from like shooting up, well, there's two things. It's CapEx and the cost of your input, which is up to 70% of the cost of your entire production and ultimately your unit economics. So I think it comes down to like the money, the logistics, and what value you're bringing to the table.
Yeah, so it's really interesting in the edible insect world. From a marketing perspective, it sort of bifurcates into two camps. One camp is that we need to grind it up and we need to put it in things in order to get people to try it. That is not my camp. I am more lean into the cricket, highlight the cricket. That's your differentiator. If I'm thinking about on a grocery store shelf, there's, you know, if you've walked down the nutrition aisle or the nutritional bar category in a grocery store lately, unless you are going there specifically to pick out a bar that is your favorite, the amount of choice that you have is actually insane. So why would I ever want to try and hide the one thing that will make me stick out from the rest of them, which is cricket? Like I almost, how many of you in here have ever walked into a grocery store and seen something with crickets in it? Okay, quite a few, but most of you have not. So do you not think that if you saw crickets on the shelf or if you saw something containing cricket on the shelf, you'd at least stop? I'm not saying you would definitely put it in your cart, but you would at least stop. So for me, leaning into the cricket and not shying away from it, not trying to call it something different, has been really important. Believe it or not, 71% of my sales year over year have been the whole cricket.
Wow.
When I first started, everybody told me you're gonna need to grind it up and put it in something to get Americans to eat it, and I'm like, well, I have a lot of sales data that says the other. So I think success for the edible insect space is capturing a portion of the seafood market. So unlike your plant-based shrimp, there is a shellfish risk for crickets. They're arthropods. So if you eat shrimp and lobster and all of that and you're afraid to eat crickets, I'm here to tell you you like your bugs swimming, and I just prefer mine crawling, and that's okay, but we can talk about it. So I think if you would capture a portion of the seafood market, I think you'd be doing great. I don't foresee insect protein at current price points, and knowing what it takes to raise them, I don't see that price point necessarily coming down anytime soon. But if you're looking at the higher end complete animal proteins, if you can get relatively competitive in there, I think you're doing well.
Okay, so beyond this hype cycle, beyond the investors looking to profit off the future of food, beyond, you know, just these short sellers and the ebbs and flows of the market, what is the biggest challenge that your business faces in getting to that next level?
I could start, yeah. I think for us, it's like making sure that we come to an acknowledgement that not just, you know, us, but really biomanufacturing, which really has the potential to decarbonize the world. There's CapEx involved with that. And typically, like, CapEx is something that's really tough for like a venture investor to put funds towards. And so I think the biggest thing for us is like there needs to be creative financing models for a lot of these solutions to come to market. And I know there's a lot of discussion in the space about like, okay, traditionally we think of 3 different types of options that could fund these CapEx projects, but we need to get more creative for that to happen.
And there needs to be just a lot more of it too.
A lot more of it, yeah.
I think for me, it's figuring out how to scale up production in an economically sustainable way. So one of the major developments in the last 6 months, and I kind of knew this 5 years ago when I started, I suppose, is that the majority of the other companies that exist in the US, I'm one of the only vertically integrated where I'm producing the crickets that are going into my products. So the other brands are forced to import their crickets from Canada or Southeast Asia. For me, for my keystone ingredient, which I'm building my entire brand on, I thought it was crazy to rely on such sources that maybe do not have the most stable of supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, figuring out how to scale that up, because what has happened in the last 6 months is some of these companies that have been around for a while, or some of the companies that are coming up, are looking for a US-based supplier of crickets. So my crickets are now white labeled in 4 different brands that exist in the US, and I have 3 waiting in the wings that if I had the crickets, they would 1,000,000% buy them from me tomorrow. But at the same time, having been here for 5 years in this industry, I know that brands come up and then they die, and then they come up and then they die. Because the reality of it is, no matter what you're in the food industry, it's a tough, cutthroat business. Like that's, one of those things people don't talk about. You talk about capital intensive, like it's a difficult industry to be in. So me tagging my growth to 1 or 2 companies and being like, well, I need to expand to be able to supply 1 or 2, but I don't know if I have the back end demand to deal with it should they go down. I was not comfortable with that. But now that we're up to like 6 or 7, it's probably time.
Very nice. I truly admire that you've been able to bootstrap. I wish I knew that was an option going into this originally, but I am so thankful because we wouldn't be here without our investors today, but I was not aware that there were other options. But I think to that point, when you have other money coming in that you have to have a fiduciary responsibility for me, it's been about, as a part of that financial prowess that they bring, is also having someone in the room that's kind of continually saying, hey, you're a food company. And reminding you to, it's going to grow like a food company. You can't do 1.0, 2.0. People hate when you reformulate things like that. It's not like a software product where you can do that. It does take more capital. It's going to take more time. You have to remember that words like bio and lab and all of these other things don't sound appetizing. So I think for me, what's been important in terms of how we grow is just making sure, again, there's always kind of that voice within the room, within the board saying, okay, like, remember you guys are a food company. Let's not lose that perspective as you guys are trying to sell in and grow your business.
So each of your companies and work, leverages with existing infrastructure and can do that more. Can you explain how that works? Each of them are really different.
Yeah, okay, so my company ties into fresh water and wastewater. And both things are 2 major pain points and bottlenecks in the industry, where like a facility might want to expand their production because there's so much demand for the goods that they're bringing to market, and they can't because the wastewater treatment facility is not sized for that expansion. So they're leaving money on the table because there's not enough like public infrastructure for this. And then what we're seeing also is just like water is becoming a crazy problem. Back when I worked at the refinery, water was a huge issue for us where we were like running out of water, and it was bringing into question whether or not our facility could continue to operate even though we made a lot of money.
Wow.
And we're seeing very similar issues in food manufacturing where companies are having to bend over backwards to source water, and it's coming at a cost.
Appreciate that. And before Shelby goes on, can you explain how that can actually plug into different infrastructure, like regionally?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we really like to talk about co-location. We talked about it at the last panel, but there's so much opportunity that we need to be talking about as an industry. Like for example, we're taking sources of nutrients that combined with water would be considered wastewater at a facility, and they go to the wastewater treatment facility, right? And you can't do much more with the capacity there. So we take it and we extract the nutrients from that and actually return 98% of that water to the manufacturer for reuse, which of course saves them a lot of money and headache. But then we can actually co-locate with a fermenter that needs that feedstock, and that fermenter is going to produce wastewater as well. And so by co-locating, we're able to leverage, I'm increasing capacity in the wastewater treatment plant, but that enables another facility to co-locate and take up that capacity, and everybody wins. And we just achieved more food into the food system.
Yeah, imagine it like the node of a regional food system for LA, or startups or producers in LA would be using the LA Municipal Water Waste Network.
Exactly. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So for crickets, Iowa's actually really primed to become a leader in the edible insect space, as it is a leader in corn, soybean, a whole bunch of different things. I always say, let's just tack on bugs at the end. So crickets, the way that you raise them, you have to have housing for them. If you don't have housing, they start to eat each other. They are opportunistic omnivores, and that given the opportunity to eat meat, aka their brother or sister, they will gladly do it. So the other way that we mitigate that is that we have to actually put animal protein into their feed. It helps to reduce the cannibalism in addition to the housing. So I know, it's always one of those
wild.
things
Like, take it in for a second.
Yes. Crickets eat each other. And if they were big enough, they would eat you too, I think. So there's no market
I believe
for,
it. I
yes,
believe it.
Same. No horse-sized crickets, please. So the other thing is, and it's really cool, and it was kind of dumb luck. One of the top 10 specialty feed mills in the US that produces one of the best insect diet feeds is 7 miles from my farm. So hyper local in terms of where I can source that feed. It has to be a non-GMO grain blend with animal protein in it as well. But so you either have to use non-GMO or organic, because the pesticide residue in conventionally grown grains is too high. May not necessarily cause an issue for you or I, but the immune systems of crickets are much smaller. So we are, low cost of living, all of the things. About the only strike we have going against us in Iowa is we keep the crickets at 87 degrees all year round. And there's 6 inches of snow at home right now.
It's a lot of energy.
So it is a lot of energy. But as we keep building new barns, we're getting more efficient on that front every time. So
We were talking about this a little bit earlier, but back to the regional co-location, like everyone helping each other out. Think about like a corn manufacturer or a soy manufacturer that the waste, like solids, go to feed crickets. And then, a company like mine that takes their wastewater, uses it to power somebody else's fermentation process that's making a precise whey protein, for example. Fermentation in precision fermentation space generates a lot of mycelium biomass or yeast biomass or bacterial biomass that could then in turn feed the crickets. And the crickets can use the residual heat from the manufacturing facility.
Wow.
yes,
Close
and
loop.
yep. As we would figure that whole loop out, I am happy to adopt it, but I'm not going to be the one to figure it out. Is what I just always say.
You've got a business to protect. I get it.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a joint venture emerging right before our eyes right now.
Yes. No, so talk to us, because yours is a little different, but it still works within traditional ag in some ways.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we use contract manufacturers. And for those of you not familiar, contract manufacturers are folks who say, hey, I built a production facility. We make food products. We have certain equipment, but we don't want to make a brand. We don't want to necessarily be the ones to sell the products that we're making. Some do, but that's, for understanding, they typically don't. So we've had to find partners and find equipment that fits our process, and I think that's been one of the challenges within the plant-based space in general, is that a lot of this equipment isn't designed for the viscosities and the forming that you need to make a plant-based product. So we've had to be a little bit creative with what we work there and invest in more capital than you normally would in a contract manufacturer. But as we think about the co-mans we use, it is trying to optimize, okay, we've got a distribution center in Illinois. How do we make sure that our shrimp co-man, our breading co-man are close enough so that we can reduce some of those carbon miles? And one of the questions that I think a lot of food companies face is, well, should I self-manufacture or should I build my own facility, because it's going to take a lot of capital, it's not sexy, all these other reasons. And the reason you go for co-manufacturing is because you reduce some of that capital spend so you can fuel your sales and marketing. So for our business model, it's we need to sell as much shrimp as possible. So if we can save on some of the CapEx and some of the operational costs, that will help us continue to grow the market and grow the business and work with amazing partners and hopefully be a catalyst for better equipment, better systems for the rest of the plant-based and beyond supply chain.
Michelle, so did that piece of advice partially come from any investors? Like, I mean, because I know also Tyson is an investor, right? And so talk about, like working within the system. I mean, they have the assets to do that better than almost anyone.
Yeah, well, Tyson is interesting because they make chicken, and I don't know, chicken's kind of a big deal within this country. So that's one of the things about working with a larger company is you aren't. While they want to invest in the future of food and be a part of that and fuel this, they have their core business to take care of. So a lot of times you're not exactly their first priority. And while their venture arm has been so supportive, so helpful, has made introductions, leveraging that Tyson infrastructure has been different because they have to make chicken, they have to make the money and make sure they're running their business effectively every day. So we really rely on them for, again, introductions, partnerships, who do they know, who do they work with, to get some of that stuff done. So it's been an interesting partnership, but I enjoy having them as a part of the team too.
Okay, so let's talk about policy and regulation a bit. Big farm bill coming up, lots of different bills all the time in different states, local. I mean, people are really getting energized about how to build a better food system. And so I'd love to hear from you. If there was one policy that could be enacted today, what would you have? Or if you could have one regulation flash, what would actually create drivable, scalable change quite quickly?
Yeah, I think from a biomanufacturing standpoint, as I mentioned, lots of capital that needs to go in to help people scale and really produce it at scale. And I think what we've seen in the energy sector, we should learn from, and we are expecting to come through the U.S. government, like a stimulus package for also biomanufacturing companies that need to scale.
So I think for the edible insect industry, one of the big hurdles right now is they're technically not recognized as grass by the FDA. Yep, so generally recognized as safe, for those of you who don't know what grass means. Edible insects are eaten all over the world by millions of people, lots of different cultures, very common, but again, it doesn't have the generally recognized as safe stamp. Therefore, certain large national retailers will not touch them until then. Quite frankly, for me, my perspective on the overall industry, I think that's fine because again, this is slow burn. I don't think big grocery is ready for cricket protein yet, quite frankly. So I don't necessarily see that as a terrible, terrible thing, but that would be helpful as a general legitimacy of insect proteins in general.
Yeah, I think on our end, and it's starting to trend in a pretty good direction if we look at plant-based milks, but a lot of the pushback, especially from the seafood industry who thinks that we're the enemy, which I do not feel as like we are the enemy. We're a yes and to kind of be a part of their organization. We are anticipating probably pushback on naming, like can you put the word shrimp on a package, just like milk was like, well, can you put milk on almond milk or meat on, Beyond Meat or something like that. But, I think everybody in this room, has anybody ever been fooled on the grocery store where they saw plant-based milk and they thought it was milk from a cow? If there's anybody in the room, I would love to understand what caused that, but I think, I believe in the intelligence of the American public to understand that if I put plant-based shrimp, they're going to understand that it is not shrimp, and that's one of the biggest talking points of some of the seafood industry is, hey, this is going to be confusing to consumers, which, again, I wouldn't, and I really respect the history of fishing, whether it's wild caught or farmed. And again, I'm not trying to be an enemy to their business. I really am even looking at other partnerships. We've even partnered with folks who do process actual seafood because, of a variety of reasons as well. So I think less about regulatory change that we need right now and more about thinking about, well, what's the pushback to this industry going to be and how can we be prepared for it, right, wrong, or indifferent?
So what's been the most surprising aspect of building this business for each of you?
I think the water and wastewater pain points have been the most surprising. Like I was in my own bubble when I was in oil refining, and then when I was like, oh, everyone feels the same pain. I think for me that was like, now I'm an insider and I can build trust because people know that I know.
I appreciate that.
That women are my target market.
That's a cool one.
When I first started this, I could have guaranteed that my target market was going to be 18 to 35-year-old males who like doing outdoor adventurous things. 18 to 35-year-old males are big old chickens when it comes to eating something like a bug. So I have sampled tens of thousands of crickets to people, and this is the whole cricket. And it is 3-to-1, women to men. Doesn't matter if they are 2 years old all the way up to, my oldest customer was a 101-year-old World War II vet that told me, ma'am, I've eaten a lot worse in the service. And I said, thank you, sir. And, but so it does not matter. Women typically tend to be more open to trying crickets. But if you really think about it, traditionally speaking, we are the gatekeepers of nutrition in the home, and we have been for years. So before we're going to give it to our family, we're more likely to try it first. So that's been probably the most surprising.
I think for me, the positive reception to some of the seafood industry as well. So for example, we found someone who can bread the shrimp, who also happens to bread clam strips. And I tell you, the guy who owns the facility looks like he's someone right off of the Deadliest Catch cast. And he was talking to me one day about, like, one of our first meetings about, you know, they keep having to go further and further offshore to get clams. And he said, quite frankly, if you don't believe in climate change, you haven't stepped outside recently. And he told me, hey, look, I truly do not believe that we're going to be able to get clams in about a decade. So that's why we want to start working with companies like you, because we realize we have to diversify now. So I think some of that positive reception and seeing these opportunities for us to work together rather than against each other has been really heartwarming and something that makes me very hopeful for the future.
Michelle, that's really, really powerful. And also, the clams. It makes me sad for the clams. So I think about them as one of the more sustainable options that's from the water. Oh.
Absolutely. I mean, oysters, clams, all those bivalves, they actually filter the ocean. So we want more of them.
We want more. Yeah. Okay. So we don't have too much more time, but I want to. All three of you are such huge experts in this food system and how you've been able to build businesses within it. And so I ask this with that in mind. Where do you see the ability to build the most climate resilience into the food system?
I think it's going to have to be a combination of things. And I think about this a lot, especially, you know, we've pivoted away from building an ingredient product. And I think part of that is, like, we were building an ingredient that was requiring a lot of capital expenses. And especially when a market gets a little bit colder, it's like you either pick your capital or you pick your brand. And I think, like, for novel ingredients, like, people are eating them. You need to build a brand. You need to tell a story that's powerful and that gets people excited to eat. And so I think that's where plant-based options have, like, the hero potential, right? To, like, really bring consumers along. And then eventually, you know, like, when the technologies in the more CapEx intensive spaces are lower in price, then, like, they've opened a really awesome door for all types of options to be consumed. But yeah, people branding, I think, is big. Expensive.
Yeah, the food business is expensive business, no matter what. And so in that vein, and kind of in the vein of this conversation of you know, having unit economics that work, having a path to profitability, that's actually, like, realistic and based in reality. I was listening to a podcast relatively recently, and I totally agree with it. Not every idea needs to scale infinitely, and I think that needs to be remembered within the food system, because I think when we start applying everything needs to be scaled infinitely, that's where we run into the problems that we have with no biodiversity, with massive food companies that are in the pockets of politicians for subsidies and all of that. So, yeah.
It was Will Harris, who I'm sure a lot of folks in this audience know, who told me scalability is way less important than replicability, right? And, like, for you.
Exactly.
And also, yeah.
Yeah.
Hits home.
Yeah, there's already a lot of data out here about how if we reduce our meat consumption, we're already having positive impacts on the environment. But I've never felt like, hey, I need to convince everybody to become vegan or vegetarian, because that's going to be an uphill battle that I'm frankly not interested in doing. However, I want to inspire people to say, hey, I can reduce the amount of meat I eat by starting with one meal a week, because I truly believe if we can have folks make a small change in their week, those effects will multiply across a population and have a much bigger impact than trying to get a few people to completely overhaul their diet. So that's how I answered the question too. There's a lot of discourse around, well, is it really up to the consumer? Like, why is it up to the consumer to save our planet and the environment based on their buying choices? And to that I would say, think about a small change you can make, but I think when you talk about climate resilience, it really has to happen up the supply chain. That's where the most food waste happens. That's where, companies like ours can start providing other options. So I think, think about a small change you can make, and then also, maybe start thinking about more systematically what you can do and change to help our environment.
Okay, last one. 1 second. One question. One word answers each. What's one food you want to see on family dinner tables in 2050?
For me, it's a steak that was grown in a bioreactor without killing a single animal.
For me, it's farm fresh sauteed crickets. I couldn't make that one word. I'm sorry. It was very specific.
I want to see more seaweed. Our product is made from a seaweed ingredient. It is so sustainable. It is so cool. I could do a whole other panel on seaweed. I hope we see more seaweed in all kinds of forms on our dinner tables someday.
Well, thank you to the legendary women on this panel with me. Thank you all for listening. We're going to be hanging out. I'm doing a book signing right after this out in the field, and we are super excited to keep having all these conversations with you. So thank you.